Welcome to the fall 2019 semester of Records Management University. We are broadcasting live from Fife Media Studios in historic Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be getting started in just a moment. My name is Chris Petty, your Dean of Admissions and co-host of RMU, and I have a few housekeeping items before we begin. Because of our awesome turnout, we'll need to mute your phones and computer mics to avoid picking up any feedback or noise. If you have a question, please use the chat window located in the bottom right of the screen. I'll be monitoring the chat session and will respond directly, or if relevant to the discussion, we'll have Dean Mitch address it. Over the next few days, you'll receive an email on how to receive a copy of today's recording, as well as other instructions on all things RMU, including credits and certifications. To those wishing to receive credits for RMU, information about them will be handed out at the end of this semester. And to our students viewing this on demand, the credits do count just as much as viewing it live, although we do enjoy the live chat discussions. As you know, RMU is certified by the Institute of Certified Records Managers. It is an official credit qualifying course worth 1 certification maintenance point per class towards your recertification. To receive a pre-approval code for the ICRM credits from Fife, you'll need to attend all 5 classes live or listen to all of the recorded sessions. If you aren't able to participate in all 5 classes, you can still receive ICRM credits, but you'll need to submit your own justification. Additionally, RMU is certified with the Association for Information and Image Management, or AIM. You can receive Certified Information Professional credits from AIM by your participation in the live or recorded sessions. And so, without further ado, I'm handing the mic over to Mitch Farbstein, our distinguished Dean of RMU. Mitch, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. It's always a pleasure. And here we are at another Tuesday. This is, as you reminded me, Over the Hump Tuesday for this semester, because this is our 3rd out of the 5th class, or the 5 classes that we're going to have. So hopefully everybody will continue paying attention and attending our sessions.
Hopefully so.
Yes. So with no further ado on my side, so we're into the 10th semester of RMU. And this semester, we are talking, for those who have not been able to join us up until now, psychiatrists and psychologists as the theme of this semester. Okay, so we are at the 3rd class, and this class focuses on we need an integrated electronic and physical record solution, and we'll deep dive that in a few minutes. I bring up all the other classes so that if you haven't been able to attend, these are still available, as Chris indicated, as recordings. We get asked on a frequent basis, do I need, as an individual, do I need to have any prereqs or anything else to attend the classes? And obviously not. And each class is somewhat independent. We don't build on class on to the next class, to the next class, to the next class. And so it gives everybody a chance to participate without having attended the other classes and get something out of it. That's really our intent. Okay, so why does Mitch hate, Chris, it says I'm muted here. People can't, okay, I think I'm all right.
Yes.
Okay.
If you can hear Dean Mitch, let me know.
If you can hear me. Okay, so I think we're okay here.
Everyone can hear you just great.
All right, aren't they lucky? Okay, so why does Dean Mitch hate records management? Because that's part of the theme of this semester. And so this is analysis. This is my analysis session 3 on myself. So in this particular case, and you'll understand a little bit more as we go through this, what am I and what would you like me to be? And that goes toward these ink blots that you see in front of you. And I'll kind of zero in on that in a few seconds. But the idea is that when you look at records management, it has multiple personalities. It's not exactly the same thing to everybody, and it's perceived differently by every organization and every individual that has to manage their records within that organization. So in some cases, if you look at pure records management, and the E and the P stand for electronic and physical records, which, you know, physical can be anything in boxes. It could be microfilm, microfiche, so on and so forth. Electronic is anything like email, Word documents, PDFs, any kind of electronic content, social media. So that becomes the hub, obviously, in our world of records management. But there's other technologies, I'll call them right now, that participate in a records management way. So whether you're doing document management as a front end to your records management, or you're doing knowledge management, business process e-discovery, every activity that basically takes place in these other technologies creates a potential record. Okay, even the actions that take place during the process become records within the system. Again, depends on the policy of your organization in terms of what you need to save as records in your organization, and whether you're looking at them as risk aversive things and that's why you save it, or it's historical information in an archive. All these things play together. And so when I look at this and then add in a couple other things like privacy and security and identification and governance and enterprise data and content inventories that have a big effect on how you manage these, inner circle of technologies, it becomes very difficult to say, okay, this is exactly what records management is, or this is not what records management is. And again, it all depends on the organization. So I go through this a lot when either, in a presentation, educational, sales, whatever it is, to try to help people to better understand what they're really trying to accomplish. Is it records management? Is it part of e-discovery? Is it part of a business process? And the end result is records management. So it really is a challenge because it's expanding. It's becoming more holistic. So this Venn diagram that I use really tries to show the interplay between all these different technologies. And there's this kind of global cloud or atmosphere around that that can also influence what's going on. That's why I hate records management during this analysis 3 session. So let's go to my therapist, okay? Hermann Rorschach, born in Switzerland in 1884, died in 1922, very short-lived lifespan. And he was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. I keep getting muted. I don't know who's muting me. We'll keep going here.
No one should be muting you.
Yeah, I don't know when that comes up. My ex-wife used to say, just shut up already.
Maybe she's dialed in.
Now my children do it to me. I don't know. Anyway, University of Zurich Medical School graduate, focused on personality identification, fascinated with klexography, which is the study of ink blots as art. It's really kind of fascinating that somebody at his early age and at that time looked at things like ink blots as something that fascinated them.
Yeah.
I think there'd be other things in the universe back in the 1800s that would be, oh, this is pretty cool,
I would think of art from a 3-year-old or something if I saw ink blots.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, just show pictures and say, this is a cool picture. It's a landscape. It's this. And so part of the idea with the ink blots was to start measuring, at least in his mind, to start measuring the unconscious parts of a subject's personality. And he first started testing this on children. So if you look at that ink blot, Chris, the first thing I see is a butterfly.
Yep, I see a butterfly as well.
Okay, but what do you do if you flip it upside down, right? So now I'm looking at this thing and saying, okay, maybe that's a smash bug on my windshield. I don't, but you may have a different idea. It's like records management. Everybody has a different perception. What is records management? What should we do? And how should we do it? And everything else. So, and then you can go to the next step here. Now, when I look at this one, if I look at the corners, I see skulls. I see human skulls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Or you can look at it as it's a door hinge. And then we flip it around. It's just something else. So it's really kind of fascinating. And, you would look at this and say, how many therapists in this day and age actually employ this technique? And the weird thing is, from what I discovered, that it's the second most an analytic tool that they use to figure out people's personalities.
Oh.
from psychiatrists. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so unfortunately, the young man died as a young man at 37 from what was they thought at that time appendicitis. So Herman did a lot of work. He's still well known in the business today, and contributed a lot to psychiatry. Not so much to records management, but the ink blots are records.
That's
Aha.
right.
I always try to tie it back. Okay, so as usual, we're going to talk about a malady and dissociative identity disorder. All right, previously known as multiple personality disorders, is a mental illness characterized by at least two distinct, relatively enduring personality states. So, there's been movies about this. There's people that have 18 different personalities. Again, it goes toward this whole idea that records management has different personalities and it's looked at differently. And every day it changes. I mean, we all go through moods during the day, but we usually have one personality. In this case, these people go through moods, and based on that mood, typically they change their personality and they forget which personality they are. So it's really a difficult situation to be in. And people learn a lot from dealing with dissociative identity disorder, just like we do from records management. Okay, so moving on. As we've done in the last two classes, and we will continue through the rest of the semester, we go through this process, a psychoanalytical process of exploration. We do an analysis, we come up with some corrective actions, and then we have a resolution. And we apply this in this semester to records management the same way in terms of looking at real life situations, for Fife, real customers that we have dealt with over the years, and try to apply these analysis approaches to understand really what took place, why did the customer do what the customer did, what did they need, and what was the resolution to what their requirements were. Okay, so what is the records management aberration? Exploration, we find that out. Why does the records management aberration exist? So there's the analysis component. Who can help the organization become records management, quote unquote, normal, whatever the heck that is? Okay, what are the available records management analysis protocols? What are the records management corrective actions to be taken to get them to what they perceive, and I'm going to use that word perceive very loosely, of what they think they want to attain in the long run. But as most of you know, records management doesn't have an end result to it. It's always changing. It's always evolving. It's evolving because technology is evolving. It's evolving because governmental regulations and industry regulations say you have to do something, and that's always changing as well. So we get to the final one. How is the records management patient progressing? What is the resolution? Did they achieve the goals that they set out to achieve at the beginning? Okay, so we're talking about the scenario for this class. Okay, large organization who wanted an integrated physical and electronic solution. Okay, I'm sure there's a lot of you out there with similar requirements or interests. And last week we talked about a small organization that needed some of this integration as well. And what we're finding in general, when we as Fife, okay, Chris, me, and my collaborators go out there, there's this need that people are starting to gravitate to, where records management becomes, it doesn't matter what the content is, okay? They want a singular system or repository, or a repository, at least as an inventory repository that knows where things are within the organization, to make it more efficient, to set rules, to follow policy, to just control the content within that organization. And we're seeing more and more that want the integrated physical and electronic solutions. Although the physical side is lessening, it's still a big player out there from what we've seen. Okay, so this organization had about 25,000 employees and 6,000 users that needed to participate in it. It's in the nuclear industry, so obviously in the nuclear world, it's highly regulated. I think the The disposition schedule for a lot of the content for at least nuclear power plants and everything is about 10,000 years. So
We'll still be around.
we'll still be around, but that leads you into the next question. It begs the next question, Chris, and that is, whatever technology you're using now, what will it look like in 10,000 years?
I imagine it hasn't even been thought of yet.
I don't think so. I think it may be just in somebody's head. We all combine all our heads like people are trying to do. So when you get into that situation, it's something that you as a records manager with long-term disposition schedules need to say, okay, if this is in a file format X, is that file format still going to be supported in the future, or do I have to do conversions of those files to something that's usable in the future? I know certain organizations like the National Archives says if you're going to submit something to us, electronic information, like a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, we really want a PDF A versus a PDF B versus a PDF Z or whatever they have, and they think that's going to be around a long time. But it's something that needs to be assessed in terms of the continuing support of the file formats as you get into long disposition schedules. Keep finding my mouse here. Okay, multiple independent networks. So because of who they are and how they secure their information, not everything can be on a single instance of the product. So they needed to look for a product that can span multiple instances and potentially allow for what's commonly called a federated search across those instances when they need to access all information within the organization. Needs to be compliant with OMB records memorandum. Well, they're part of the nuclear industry, and guess who governs the nuclear industry? And that's the Department of Energy in the United States. If you're outside of the country, and as far as the federal government, and so there are really strict requirements in terms of who governs and how it's governed. I remember I asked the question several semesters back with one of the national laboratories. Okay, I think it was Livermore National Lab, and I was asking in general, how many organizations or agencies or whatever put demands on you in terms of your record keeping and have requirements that you have to follow? People were sending things in like 10, 3, 7. They have 50 different organizations that they have to abide by in terms of how they manage their records. And so they're part of the nuclear industry, and it's a major challenge for them. But the example, I'm just giving it to you to say that there are organizations that manage their records, but it's not compliance with just a singular entity. It's very challenging to be able to manage all of that and the categorization and disposition schedules. So on the needs to be compliant with OMB, that's a federal regulation by the Office of Management and Budget, and it's supported by the National Archives as well. It's the presidential memorandum, basically. Adheres to the National Archives. I just mentioned that because a lot of times that information needs to also not always move to the National Archives, but the permanent stuff tends to go there in the long term, and it could be in 10 years, 15 years, it could be in 50 years. It all depends what kind of information it may be. Required metrics using dynamic and static reporting. They wanted to know where everything was once they had it under control, because again, it's important information. If I'm managing content related to a nuclear power plant or nuclear bombs, okay, now these are dramatic requirements because of the industry that they are in. But in a lot of ways, it's no different than guns. It's no different than the pharmaceutical industry, where people are at risk if something goes wrong. Okay, if your washing machine breaks, yeah, big deal. As long as your kid's not in the washing machine, you should be fine. But in terms of other industries, okay, that support records, some of it is very important. I was just in New Orleans, Chris. You know that, right?
That's right.
Okay. And in New Orleans, they just had a building collapse while I was down there. It was like a mile and a half. I wasn't drinking that night, so I didn't cause the problem.
What did you do?
Yeah, what did I do? I sound like my mother. But anyway, So a building collapses down there, and it was a new Hard Rock Cafe, and it was about 18 stories high. They were just building it, brand new, and half the building collapsed, killed a couple of people. But the whole point of that is the records are so important in that case in terms of construction, because obviously there's going to be many lawsuits. There's going to be discovery of all that information in terms of materials and everything else. That is why it's important to manage your records from day one, from that the point of contracting for that building to be built. Okay, all those records needed to be secured and be made available, because those records are missing. Now what happens? Very important. Perfect example. So they needed to know where things were, and they wanted to be able to report on the activity within those records. And for this particular case, they also followed the Department of Defense with the JITC, Joint Interoperability certification. And for those of you in the commercial world who really don't care about it, the benefit of it, and I mentioned this over and over, is that it actually is an external neutral organization who certifies those products to say, yes, it does what it says it's supposed to do in terms of records management. Okay, so this was the exploration for this large organization. Then we got into the analysis. Okay, they required installations on several different networks, as I mentioned. This was very important to them. Limited but highly experienced technical resources and records manager. I think this is very important to just point out that what we run into in a lot of cases is you don't have, and this is the limited part, you don't have a lot of people within organizations from the IT side, from the governance side, that have true experience in terms of managing and qualifying the system that they want to use. And so when we encounter an organization that has, it can be limited, but as long as they have a couple of highly experienced technical resources, it makes the implementation and the long-term support much easier. And then if you have a records manager who has experience, who's done this a couple of times, they really do have a good idea of what they want to do. And the collaboration between the two is immense in terms of being a successful project. They want it on premises instead of in the cloud. A lot of it has to do with how secure their information is. And in a sense, a lot of organizations still aren't at the level of trusting the cloud for their important information. Current solution for physical records was being sunsetted. We see this all the time. A lot of people have had, a records management solution for physical records for, many years. And things have changed. The way they manage their warehouses have changed. The use of different barcode technology has changed. So we're seeing that there's a lot of physical record systems being sunsetted or, in effect, put on the shelf. And so they had that kind of situation, and they wanted to make sure that going forward, they're going to be able to manage these physical records, and they have a lot of physical records. So that's basically where they started at, and they wanted to begin their implementation. Then they really wanted to start taking care of all the other supporting documents that come in electronically. And those are obviously email, file shares with unstructured content. And basically, the unstructured content tends to be if you have a Word document or a PDF, basically that's unstructured content. You have some structure to it because you have the labels, you have the indexing values, you have the metadata that's associated with those file shares. And most organizations do have file shares. The more superior way to do file shares for a lot of organizations has been to move to SharePoint. That gives you a lot more structure, I should say, in terms of labeling the content. So it's a little bit more easily searchable. You can apply more of the rules of retention and disposition and so on. So with that, and then they also had legacy applications that were generating content, just like every organization does. And legacy applications could be your financial system. It can be your, policy system. It could be your HR system, your manufacturing system. We're all generating content. And also there's content typically from a document management perspective that's linked into the other legacy systems. Like if you had an accounts payable system, a lot of times you have a document management system that has connectivity to that accounts payable system. So then when I'm in that system and I want to call up an invoice, I can do that very, very readily. So these are, again, systems that are generating other kinds of content. And part of the challenge is what do you do with that content, and how do you manage as a record? And do you manage it internally within your records management system, or you leave it where it is and have really connection to that? So those are also some of the challenges that go on with different environments. Okay, next. Okay, when a document management as records management front, and I've mentioned this several times in the past, that in order to truly have a great records management system, and I'm not saying it just from the idea of this vendor is better than that vendor. I'm saying it from a policy and implementation point of view, where you need to have something that's controlling what's going on before it ever becomes, not becomes a record, but ever gets into the records system, the official repository. And that's what I was saying with file shares and SharePoint to a certain extent. You want something that controls that from the beginning, from the birth of that potential record, and how you label it and how you index it and how you manage it even before it becomes a record, because you all have situations, everybody does, where you have versioning that's taking place in your document management system, because that's what they're really designed to do, allow you to collaborate, allow you to do a lot of things within that document system before it becomes a record. And then you have the decision, okay, is every version a record, or is one version at the end where it's declared a record in the document management system? Is it moved to another file folder that says these are all records? All these things need to be considered. And if you do the homework up front with your document management system, and that declaration is made, it's easy to be done, and it just flows into your records management system, that's what happens. There are certain organizations that as soon as a document is created, they have to label it, okay, and give it its metadata or its indexing values and its category and its this and that and that, to make sure that the back end doesn't become too cumbersome, that somebody doesn't have to look at, the records manager doesn't have to go in there and look at every document that's created in an organization. So you want to have a really defined structure using document management, and they had a system in there, it wasn't what they really needed. So at the same time, say, you know what, we're going to have the back end. I got to make sure my front end is what will be efficient and relieve the people on the back end for managing these very important records.
I think that's one of the misconceptions out there for some organizations is, well, hey, I've got a great SharePoint system, or I've got another sort of document management or file sharing system, and this is checking that box for records management. And yeah, it's really not, because records management is kind of taking it to that next level.
Oh yeah, it's much different, Chris. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about records management later on in reference to archiving, just real archivists. And so yeah, it's a strategy. This whole thing is a major strategy that has to be considered from the top to the bottom, to the west to the east, and everything else. When you really have an organization that it's important that records are managed, all records are managed properly. You don't do it overnight. This has to build. So people who had document management systems for years and years and years, and it's worked, fine for them and it's sufficient, that's great. That makes your life so much easier. If you just don't know where anything is, and you're starting, you say, well, I'm going to bring my records. Your records management system is not going to solve your front end issue. It just won't. Okay. Bulk migration of existing e-content and physical record, they're tracking the data. So if you have say on physical records, they wanted to move all the metadata, the data about the boxes, about the folders in the boxes and the content. They just wanted to move all that into the records management system. And then depending on what they're doing with the boxes, they may scan the barcodes and reset where things are in the warehouse. But they had a lot of this information already, and they didn't want to start from scratch, obviously, because there's key information in there. So we were able to migrate all that into our system, so they didn't really lose much time in doing it. They didn't have to rekey it. And then they had a migration of a lot of content in what they were, using for the document management system, and they wanted to move that. And it wasn't just the content. When you move something, you migrate something, you got two main things. You got the object, so a PDF, or you have a Word document, and you have some indexing values associated with it. You don't want to have to recategorize everything through auto-categorization. If you have enough information about it, that should be sufficient to do the migration. But that has to be packaged up properly. We have customers that have hundreds of millions of these little things that are records, and moving from one system to another is painful. And that's why when you look at acquiring records management systems, I know a lot of you already have them. A lot of people are still looking because of either sunsetting or they're just starting to really get into the records management part of it, is knowing that it has long-term viability, that the product, the vendor will be around for a long period of time, not gobbled up by everybody else. So you're evaluating not only the records management system capabilities, you're evaluating the vendor to make sure that vendor is going to be around. And it's not going to be switching hands. They're not going to be switching technology. They are not going to be sunsetting products. Okay. And you can look at the company, you can see the history and make that determination. And then 8, needs to implement the federal general record schedule. And for this particular customer, yes, they really had to take they really wanted to take advantage of the general schedule, and then they can embellish it. In fact, anytime you take a general record schedule or any kind of record schedule, there's always peculiarities within your organization or industry, and whatever system you have should be able to readily accommodate the minor changes or the major changes that are required by your industry. And you should have the ability, without going back to the vendor, to be able to change those categories, to change those schedules as necessary to meet regulation. Okay, moving on to corrective actions. So obviously in this particular case, and with most of our customers, is a phased approach with physical records as the initial focus for this customer, okay? They didn't say, okay, we're gonna do physical records, we're gonna do electronic records, we're gonna do social media, we're gonna do email, we're gonna do, it doesn't work that way. It's too complex to be able to accomplish all that. And if you're hearing, well, it'll take you 3 months to get everything, but it doesn't. I'll be very honest with you. Chris knows this as well. This is from experience. Sometimes it takes 6 months to even get these computers set up, okay, and get permissions and get the infrastructure in place to begin a project. And one of the things that I typically ask our customers is, how long does it take you to provision servers? Okay. Now, in the cloud, it's obviously easier because either we're provisioning the cloud that we use, let's say Amazon Cloud Services, or the Microsoft one, Azure. Okay, and there's many out there. IBM has them, Oracle has it, and those things are kind of ready to go. But it just doesn't end there, because there's always the permissions to access it and so on. There's other infrastructure considerations, but a lot of times it takes 6 months before they can get everybody on board and they can acquire all this infrastructure. So you look at that part of it, and then on top of that, you have just the organization getting their act together to make sure everybody is in sync. So typically what you're looking at, even for physical records, is probably 6 months, unless you're doing a migration from one warehouse to the other. That just takes time too, because everything has to be rescanned, and we've seen that as well. So you really want to look at what your long-term goal is. And some of our customers, they just want to do physical records. Some of them don't want to do physical records. Some of them just want to do electronic records. It's either one or the other, basically. And some want to do both, as we're talking about here. So a phased process is in most cases a little simpler if you're only doing one technology, but there is a phase to it, because if you do electronic, then you say, okay, I'm going to do email first. And after I get email, because it's kind of a simple approach, ties to my Exchange server, everything just flows in, it gets journaled in. It's a lot easier. But now if you start taking a look at the other electronic versions of things, like Word documents, PDFs, you start looking at data feeds from your legacy applications, you start looking at social media, you start looking at tweets and all those things that are out there, you want to phase each of those in as well. Okay.
Dean, Mitch, a question for you. So for an organization that's looking to tackle a bunch of different record types, and they want to follow a phased approach, typically is it better for them to start with sort of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit first, or tackle sort of the biggest problem and
Okay, it's a great question, Chris, and the true real answer from what I've experienced is you have some senior managers sitting up there that don't want to do records management, right? They don't see this, they don't want to expend the money unless legal is beating them over the head or somebody else in the organization. So they're saying, why am I spending this money? You got to show them some success. So in order to show some success, you typically don't pick the hardest thing to do, because the hardest thing makes you learn everything without any experience. If you take something simpler, and that's why I kind of referred to particularly email, because email is well defined. Okay, it's typically coming from one server or a farm of Exchange servers or Google servers or cloud servers, whatever it may be for your mail. And it comes in, you can grab the metadata off the to, from, the subject. You can interrogate the content of it. You can extract the attachments and save one copy of it so it doesn't become too big a store that you need. And so a lot of people really want to start with email, but in some cases their emails are taken care of. They're archiving in another system, and now the focus becomes the file shares, the SharePoints, and maybe the legacy applications. So in that particular case, you would elect something like SharePoint as maybe your entree, and show that success and demonstrate, yeah, we have this under control, and then move on. Because typically, the cost going on a continual basis, you still have to go back to the well, maintenance in the future and all those kinds of things. You want to establish that, you want to establish that success, and you want to make sure you're getting recognized for what you're doing, and that senior management knows if you're successful. If you're not successful, then you have a different issue. But yeah, I would say go with the thing that you can show the most success in the shortest period of time.
Okay, great.
Right. Consolidated physical and electronic record schedule, reducing support. What we mean by this, and what helped them, is you create one record schedule, and the record schedule just says, okay, if this is the category or this is the kind of content, this is my disposition and retention schedule for that. I don't care if it's physical record. I don't care if it's an electronic record. And the big difference is when you come to disposing of physical records is a lot more effort. All right. And, it has to be, shredded. It has to be destroyed in some way. You have to track that it was shredded, and that tracking then becomes another record in the system. So the elimination and this disposition of the physical content is a lot more challenging. But the idea is that if I'm storing a Word document, a PDF, on a disk, okay, the computer system knows where it is. Okay, if I'm storing a box on a shelf in a warehouse, the computer system knows where it is. The only real difference is it can't destroy it. It can't obliterate that from the record system. But all the other things you can do, you can track it, you know what it is, you know where it is. It's just a little bit more challenging on physical records. So having a consolidated physical and electronic record schedule says if it's an email, okay, in this category, it has the same disposition that this physical piece of content is if it's the same category. Okay, integrity with or integrated with their identity management solution. This is always an interesting component where a lot of organizations, and I've mentioned these technological things like single sign-on and LDAP and other applications that are out there, and some organizations only use kind of those standard ways of, in effect, permissioning the access to the content. Whereas when you have an identity management system, it sits outside the standard system, and it gets very sophisticated because it has more properties to it in terms of what people can do and when they move around and where they are and so on. And then tying into that is the records management system, because depending on how you set it up and how secure your records management system is, you want to be able to control access to maybe a higher level than just having single sign-on that allows people's own. Single sign-on is basically, I sign on to this application, but when signing on to this application, it kind of spans over other applications in my organization. I don't have to go in and log into every application. That's what single sign-on does. And LDAP gives you other kinds of controls, or active directory, let's just call it that to simplify it, that communicates with the records management system and other systems within the organization. Identity management systems are typically a step up from that in terms of sophistication. Tailored workflows to address specific processes during capture. They had a lot of work processes that were generating records, and so they wanted to make sure that the workflows that they had in place at the time weren't really allowing for those records to be generated at the end. So they kind of replaced a lot of that, took our workflow product at that point, and were able to tailor their business processes so that the end result was a record rather than somebody having to do more manual processing at the end of that transaction to create that record. And we see more and more interest in that type of approach. So in terms of the life cycle is known to the workflow. The workflow just gives you that record at the end of the process. Physical records with unlimited search description fields. This is one of the things that they had asked us for. With records management, when you're using physical records, you usually have the metadata about it, and you save that. But in their particular case, they wanted to take a description field of what was in the box, what was in the folder, and instead of scanning everything in, they wanted to put enough properties about that in an unstructured way. And so the benefit to them by doing that was that I could take all that unlimited search description field, 10,000 characters if they wanted it, and they can put it into the full text search engine to really narrow down and find specifically what they want and not depend on date, author, title, and a few other items. Now, in their particular case, electronically, when they had objects that were coming into the system itself would strip all that content out. So the difference is the description fields had to be entered, okay, manually to a certain extent, or it was already in their existing sunsetted physical record system, versus an electronic system where it's part of the process of ingesting the content. Common schedule and categories across electronic and physical records. This just makes it so much easier for the records manager because you set this up for one, and you don't have to say, well, again, going back to the whole idea, the physical records and electronic records are basically the same in terms of the retention disposition schedules. So you want to be able to set up the categories to cross both of them. And that makes the records manager's responsibility in life just a lot easier because it's not maintaining basically two sources of truth.
Right.
Implement, okay, the DoD for them, and when we have all chapters is really the point here. There's the basic functionality within the DoD. There's another one with that addresses FOIA, okay, the Freedom of Information Act, and then there's another chapter that has to do with classified documents, and they needed all three of them, and then that gave them, the confidence that they'll be able to do the kind of records management that they needed to do based on who they are. Okay, so moving on. So now we got to the resolution. So this really starts talking about, all right, we went through the analysis, we figured out what we needed to do, we did the corrective actions, and now where are they? Okay. Are they happy campers, they say? You know, is everything going smoothly? What are their plans for the future? And when we engage with a customer, we really want to know what you're going to do once we get to that point. Okay. What is your goal? And we ask these questions to our customers, and a lot of times they don't know what the end goal is because there is no end goal. So you want to set at the beginning a select, what do I want to call it? A select list of things you're trying to attain that shows success. Okay. Remember, we talked about success in the first steps. Now we want to talk about success at the end and make sure that we at least accomplish certain goals. And we have to know those goals at the beginning, otherwise we have no target. Okay, records under control, manageable, and reportable. Obviously, that's the most important thing. And when we were done, they felt they really did. They knew what they had, they were able to manage it, and they can report on it. And management is really managing the life cycle of either from the start of ingestion all the way through to the records management and to disposition. They created, with our help, workflows to match their work processes to reduce the manual effort. That I mentioned that before, and that was a major goal, and they were very successful in doing that. And again, their processes are going to change. So the workflows that we work with them on, and they have ownership of it, they can change it whenever they want to. They're not dependent on the vendor, and that's really, no matter who you work with, that's really should be one of your goals, is independence from the vendor to do what you need to do. You want them to train you up. Hopefully you have the resources to do that, so that you control your own destiny in terms. You don't have to keep going back to the vendor and asking them to do stuff, because all that does is slow up your processes.
Yeah, and they know their business better than the vendor.
Oh,
They could do it, build out a workflow so much faster than going to a vendor and trying to explain their business process.
Absolutely, and you can be successful. You can fumble. The vendor will support you, but in our particular case, we prefer the customer to manage their own destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Two different networks. So again, as one of their goals, they needed to have multiple instances of the product, and with those multiple instances, be able to participate in the federated search if they need it. Metadata full text search of electronic and physical records using one interface. So as I mentioned before, having the metadata, having the full text available, and having basically a singular search interface would allow them to say, okay, show me all the records that have to do with, I don't know, this nuclear, what's something good in the nuclear industry? Our fuel rods, okay? Or, in this particular cases, they weren't so much into nuclear power plants, they're more into nuclear weapons. So they needed to be able to, get to everything that had to do, the shipping documents, the invoices, anything that had to do with a nuclear, basically a bomb.
Right.
All right. So they wanted to have one interface. They wanted to go to one interface for physical and one interface for electronic, and try to merge all that stuff into, let's say, a collection. Okay. And that collection, through the other technologies I'll mention to you in a minute, and I also presented this earlier in this case management thing, when there's an issue or whatever, you need to collect all the information and then have it go through a process. This again goes back to my Venn diagram, where you're really starting to tie all this stuff together, and they work together. They have to work together to make it efficient and to make sure you're getting everything that you need when something has to be discovered.
Well, and the full text search is huge, because I think that's people don't think of necessarily metadata all the time when they're trying to find information very quickly.
Right.
They're just thinking of the topic, or in this case, we're looking at fuel rods. It's kind of like so much like a Google search, not to plug Google, but it's
yes.
you're looking up the topic, not the metadata.
No, you're exactly right, and that's how people do e-discovery. That's if you think about the upcoming generation, and I'm not part of that. You can tell by my pictures.
You'll be here longer than any of us.
Yeah. But as long as they stay away from the fuel rods. But people now are so comfortable doing full text searches, and Google is the perfect example of that. You don't go in there, you're putting in what you think is metadata, but it's just full text stuff. There's no structured database sitting out there that's allowing you to search that way. And they have advanced searches and you can narrow things down, but it's still basically a full text search. Okay. The amazing thing about Google, and I got to admit, when that stuff comes back and it says it found in 2 seconds 120 million things. I mean, you keep going. Give me the next 3. Give me the next 10. Give me the next 10. You never get to very far. And their engines are set up so whoever paid the most comes up first.
Right.
You don't have to worry about in your records management system because you're not paying. Nobody's paying you for it that way. Implemented enterprise document management, feeding the records. So they did replace their document management system, and so anything that's created in the front end automatically can feed the back-end records management system. Met all requirements and positioned for consolidation. It should be consolidated expansion. They're an agency that's growing. They're adding more people, adding more sub-agencies to the fold. And so for them, they needed to have the technology in place so they can absorb these other agencies rather than trying to absorb them without having the technology in place, which makes it a very muddled environment because, then the agencies that they're absorbing have their own way of managing records, and you start getting, like I said, muddled. It's just, you have too many things where you have to, not have policy, or you have policy, but some of the technology doesn't lend itself to that kind of policy. And then on to new requirements they wanted to do case management for the Freedom of Information Act. Obviously, they're governed by that, and task management as well. So once part of the phasing of this was to get the records under control, know what the back end's going to do for them, and now anything else they want to do, they can either go to the records management system and extract content or collections to do in other areas, or they wanted to make sure that whatever they're doing is going into this back-end record system. Okay, so that's how we got through our nuclear friends here. And so proceeding now with the rest of the presentation for today, we go into this consciousness checklist, and we've gone through the first 2. So each class we're doing one of the 5 today. Do I have the energy? And it's not me. I know I have the energy. Do you have the energy to address all of the potential records management obstacles to success? So here are the kind of questions you should be asking yourself. I'm not going to ask you the questions. This is not a test, but it's just kind of a laundry list of things to think about, things we've learned that in order for records managers to be successful, to have the kind of energy that they need to do this. So do I have the energy to address all of the potential records management obstacles to success? All right. Have I been able to get support from other organizational resources? Do you have a group of individuals? Do you have a group of departments that support you? I mean, you can take a look at your position right now and say, am I getting support? Are the departments interested in what I'm doing? Do they care about what I'm doing? Okay, am I an island unto myself, and I'm just kind of, charging through and telling everybody that records management's great, and nobody really is paying much attention to it? Am I successful soliciting feedback from senior management on my efforts? Obviously, you need to know that. And it's not only your direct boss, because your boss, typically, if it's your direct boss, is not that high up in the hierarchy. Okay, you want to find, you know, the champions there that are interested in what you're doing, the successes. And again, going back to my earlier comments on Chris's question about, you know, in terms of phasing and the importance of that, you're hoping that somebody on high is interested in your success in your projects. We see this a lot, and, you know, and we do a lot of work in the federal government as well as the commercial world. It's tough to find real champions in the federal space. Okay, and I'm not condemning it. I'm just saying people move too quickly. All right, they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out. Where executives in general corporations seem to be a little bit more stable. And so when you have that, you probably have a better chance of a continuation of support of your program. That's just organizational behavior at that point. Do I have a look ahead plan for expanding the records program? Am I looking just short term, or do I really have a 5 to 10 year plan? That's what records management implementations, to really get successful, need to have. Have I simplified the capture and categorization of records? Okay, look at your processes. Are they simple? Are they reliant on the users to make declarations about the categories, or is the stuff kind of just flow in and auto-categorized, or take advantage of other technologies that make the process simplified? If you start to get into complex processes for declaring records, capturing records, and everything else, it's going to be very hard to be successful. I'm not saying you won't be, but it's going to be a much bigger challenge. And do you have the energy to manage that? Have I undertaken a strategy to reduce the number of physical records? Well, you know, it's to look ahead and looking at the organization and how much physical records are you still generating? You're always going to generate some. How much? And then we do this with some of our customers. You know, they're looking at reducing the size of their warehouses. They don't want bigger warehouses. It costs a lot of money. It costs a lot more money to store physical records than it does to store electronic records in the long run. So, you know, looking at that, how are records being created? And so it's something to noodle and figure out for your organization. Do I have a predictable annual budget for supporting the records program? You know, once you get it in, there's maintenance, there's long-term goals that you've set, and is this a one-time shot? And after that, you're going to have to beg, borrow, and steal to get any money. That's what makes it very, very challenging long-term, and we see this over and over and over. They have the capital expenditure up front, or, you know, one of the ways to alleviate some of that is to go up into the cloud, where you're doing more subscription-based rather than on-premises. And you can get on-premises systems based on the subscription rate too. And typically they're going to be a long-term subscription, because you're going to keep stuff for a number of years. So it needs to be considered in that way too. Do I still have a life outside of records management? Okay, you know, there's a balance here. And, you know, you feel that, you know, and I've talked to a lot of records managers who really are, you know, focused in on it, and it tends to become their life, but it can't be your life. I mean, you have to make reasonable decisions and not fret over them, because again, you're the expert. You're the person that knows this better than anybody else in your organization, or, you know, your cohorts within the organization are also part of the records management program. And you got to make the decisions, and nobody else is going. They shouldn't really have the ability, because they don't have the knowledge to question these things. So, you know, make it your own. Charge ahead and be successful. Okay, so let us help you help yourself. The records management twists and turns. So, solution insight. When you decide what solution you're interested in, new, because you're always going to be looking at new technology, because you're looking at different technology, maybe for social media. You may be looking at something to replace your physical record system, whatever it may be. Understand what you're getting. I find this over and over and over. They said, I didn't know you could do that. Oh, I didn't know it worked that way. Okay. Take the time to explore with your vendor how it works. Okay. And sometimes it's not allowed. And I understand if you're part of certain county governments, they don't allow you to really communicate with the vendors. It's a bid process. It goes out there. They say, you know, you get an hour for a demo or an hour to visit us, but these are our requirements. It doesn't matter how many requirements you list, there is going to be an interpretation that takes place, and that needs to be understood. So when you're going through this process, make sure you really do feel comfortable with the vendor you're working with, and ask the questions. And if your rules are you can't ask the questions, you get what you know what you select. There's not much else you can do.
Yeah, it's kind of like the measure twice, cut once. You know.
Yeah.
You want to make sure you're finding the right vendor and they're providing the right solution for you.
Yeah, but you need to know what you need. And that's why sometimes consultants are really a benefit, and sometimes they can drag the process on for ages, and you spend all your money on the consultants. You never get anything done. We're pretty honest on this, aren't we, Chris?
Yeah. I'm just looking at that picture of that guy in knots.
Yeah, I know. I thought that was a great picture, and that's obviously Freud supposedly doing that. It's not me.
No.
Can't grow that much hair. Conflicting agendas, that's an internal thing in terms of IT has an agenda, okay, of what they need to do. The governance team, if you have one, has their agenda. You have your agenda. You got to make sure that the agendas are meshing and everybody has the common goal. And sometimes they don't. And we see this over and over in both commercial and government. And it's something that needs to be decided early on to avoid some finger pointing. Known inventory, again, twists and turns. Know what you have out there and where the records are, you know, and just feel that you have this inventory that you can go to, because even if you phase something in, the inventory is not all taken care of at one time. All right, and you need to know what that's going to look like going forward. Category granularity, you know, look at things like Big Bucket, where I don't have as many categories as maybe, you know, some other organization is doing, because as you get too granular, it gets too confusing. It's too much effort to label it, and try to really look realistically at your records and figure out how many categories you truly need. Installation permissions. This is one of the biggest obstacles we run into when we're installing the systems. Permissions to do something, permissions for the vendor to install certain components of their software, and have you know, kind of a free flow to be able to install it within a reasonable amount of time. We've seen installations that do take 6 months.
Yeah.
And it's crazy, because it normally could take you, you know, a day to load the software and you're ready to go. The database is set up, but the database isn't given the users permissions because it's not tied to Active Directory, which is not allowing them to do a single sign. It just gets crazy. So just be prepared that, you know, when your IT people are getting involved, ask them about some of these things.
Yeah, just have the right people involved, IT, security, the key stakeholders who are going to be making this decision with regards to the solution.
Right, and pray that your IT, you know, this is complex stuff. And, you know, this is what I get back to earlier when I was talking about this customer. They had very knowledgeable technologists, and that helps tremendously. Purge then merge, you know, decision is, do I get rid of all the junk first before I move it into the records management system, or do I move everything into the records management system and then purge it then? Two different trains of thought. Some people just want to get control of everything, move it all into the records management system, I'll clean it up in the back end. And the systems have the ability to do that for deduping and finding non-probable records that, you know, I really don't need to keep. End of life decisions, and that's not you as a records manager. That has to do with your content and figuring out, what do I do when the disposition needs to take place? Am I moving it to another agency? Am I moving it to the National Archives? Am I totally destroying? Am I obliterating both the object and the metadata, or do I keep the metadata to prove that I had the record, et cetera, et cetera? And, you know, am I locking it down because it's in a legal hold? Okay, so that's kind of the main presentation for today. As always, we talk about, you know, you're checking your sanity through the Fife Records Management community site, where a lot of interesting topics are explored through the participants of Records Management University. They chime in. I think there's a lot of interest in it. And so what I did today to do something a little different. So I went out to the community and I found this. I hadn't seen this. It's been out there for a while. Does anyone here work with old historical records, documents? Any archivists? Any museum worker people? What's the oldest document you have? And I thought it was pretty fascinating, some of the answers that were there. And I encourage you to take a look, to join in, to see what people are talking about, who your colleagues, in essence, that everybody's facing records management challenges. So the partnership of 1837 was between Procter and Gamble, and they're still around. It's basically, their healthcare products and everything else. They're about $70 billion company now, because they divested some of their food-oriented products a bunch of years ago. But Arizona mining documents when they're still part of New Mexico, payment ledgers in 1830 of Loudonville, Ohio. But this great, colonial pastures correspondence from New Netherland. Do you know where New Netherland is, Chris?
I do not.
Okay, New Netherland is basically the area of New York, Massachusetts. It's when the Dutch came over. They call it New Netherland.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then they had correspondence back to Amsterdam.
Oh, wow.
So having those records is pretty cool. So on the next slide, what I just wanted to do very briefly was, a lot of times this comes up. What's the difference between a records manager and an archivist? Okay. The records manager is usually more concerned with managing records throughout their life cycle, things we've talked about, which will probably include archiving of the records at some point, at the end point. Okay, so if they're permanent records, you may move them off and let the archivist manage it. Okay, and the archivist is responsible for long-term preservation of the records, right? The permanent records. And what is the difference between records management and archivists or archives? Okay, records management is the systematic control of records from creation by a person or organization up to including disposition of those records. All right. The archive this is where they place the records after the permanent records, after it goes through the records management life cycle. All right. So they have the idea here. And then the records that we just talked about, and that's why I pulled this in, is because they were really talking about archiving historical records, which are obviously very, very important to somebody at some point. Will you have a lawsuit over it? Probably not. But the idea is a lot of people confuse these sometimes, and they are different roles within an organization. Okay, so from Faith's perspective, this is what we do, whether it's physical records, electronic records, we tie in discovery, it's content capture. So we put all these puzzle pieces together, and this is what we do as a business. What I do as Records Management University is just the sharing of knowledge that we've gained over the years. And our experience has been records management is a challenging, rewarding environment, but it takes a lot of work. Okay, upcoming events. We are at ARMA next week, right? Next week, yeah.
Next week or this? Yeah.
Next week.
This weekend.
Oh, yeah. 7 days from yesterday is basically when it starts. We will be there in Nashville. So bring your cowboy hats. I'll have mine. And if you want to, come over to our booth. We do have a booth there. Take pictures. We'll post them up afterwards on probably the last RMU of the semester. And love to meet you, greet you, and talk to you.
It's always great to see our students in person, hear your stories firsthand. So yeah, please definitely stop by our booth if you're at the ARMA show.
Absolutely. So, and then Knowledge Management World, if you're in the DC area, is a very big show. I think it covers a lot of topics related to records management. It's not all just pure records management. And then we have our DC Live sometime in the spring, where we host a pretty good forum of industry pundits who will come in and talk. It's not really a sales pitch. It's really an educational conference. Okay, so who's next on the couch? It's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross class, and we'll be zeroing in on her and talking about things like PII, personally identifiable information, and which has become a bigger and bigger challenge for records managers. So I don't know if there's any burning questions. I know we've gone over. I try to stay on time, but I just have so much to say. So I'll let you send those in, and then whatever we don't get to, or if we don't get any today, we'll just repost them up in the community.
Yeah, I mean, so I've tried to answer a lot of questions as they were coming in.
Oh, okay, great.
Individually. Maybe just one question here.
Yeah.
Are there any sort of big trends right now as it relates to document retention, particularly for private firms with regards to digital records? Like
yeah, give me that question again.
So are there any sort of current trends with document retention for private organizations?
Well, private organizations, I don't know if I don't think that's, you mean commercial. I think you just, is it, it's hard. I don't know what a private organization
I think they're talking about for
a law firm, or
like it says a private global firm.
Oh, it could be a private financial. Okay. Not really, in the sense that unless regulations are changing significantly, what the challenges that you have are on an international basis are the privacy laws that are coming about, the GDPRs,
yes,
the stuff in California. That's the big issue that's facing all of you, because you're storing probably a lot of personally identifiable information. All right. And understanding the rights that the person has that you're keeping information on is going to be very, very critical. And if you don't follow those rules, you are highly exposed to fines. Okay, there is a definite penalty, and it's not like a hand slap. There's major millions of dollar fines that can be levied, especially if you're in the European Union.
Right.
And it's going to, and California is the same thing, and it's being more and more adopted throughout the world by different countries. And there's collaboration between, I don't call it collaboration between the countries, but it's I don't know what it is, but if you're a
reciprocity,
you're right, because if you're a business in California and you're dealing in Europe, you have to understand both. There is a relationship there. So that's the only thing that I'm seeing right now that's really a burning issue that you're going to face, whether you're a privately held or publicly held company. Now, it depends on your size. In different states, it's different, but and how you cross trade your services. But that's the thing I see most important right now to consider.
Okay, fantastic.
All right. Okay, so we're done, almost. All right. So that's our next class in 2 weeks. We're over the hump. The email's coming. It's raining email, and it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. It always is. And that will be close to Halloween. So if
it's spooky time.
So we'll try to make it not too scary for you. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. If we didn't get to your question, please post it in the community forum. And hope to see some of you out at ARMA next week.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.